From New York, this is Democracy Now! 1.5 Senate debates were held in Georgia Sunday night ahead of the state's runoff election, which will decide who controls the U.S. Senate. In one debate, the richest senator in the United States, Republican Kelly Loeffler, sparred with the Reverend Raphael Warnock. In the other debate, the Democratic challenger, Jon Ossoff, stood on stage alongside an empty podium because Republican Senator David Perdue refused to take part.
Well, it's a strange situation to be asking a question of a sitting United States senator who is not here to debate as he asks for the votes of the people to be reelected.
The debates came a day after President Trump held a rally in Georgia and called on Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp to overturn the election. But Kemp refused to do so. We'll go to Georgia for the latest. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S. is heading towards 15 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, as daily cases are averaging close to 200,000 a day. The reported death toll has topped 282,000, with hospitalizations now over 100,000. Experts warn the grim figures do not yet account for spikes related to Thanksgiving travel. Hospitals and the 9/11 emergency call system are being stretched to their breaking point as frontline health workers scramble to care for patients. In California, San Francisco, and 4 other Bay Area counties proactively went into a strict lockdown Sunday to prevent more infections, even though the area does not yet meet Governor Gavin Newsom's threshold for a full lockdown. Under the new order, businesses, including hair salons and spas, theaters, museums, sports venues, and bars, must close. Restaurants will be limited to takeout and delivery. Nearly 85% of California residents will now be under stay-at-home orders through Christmas. In news from Washington, D.C., President Trump announced Sunday his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, tested positive for COVID-19. He was reportedly admitted to a D.C. hospital. In immigration news, over 1,000 unaccompanied refugee children in U.S. custody have tested positive for COVID-19 since March. In economic news, the Labor Department's job report released Friday showed U.S. job growth slowed significantly in November, with 245,000 jobs added last month, less than half the jobs added in October. This comes as a bipartisan group of senators say they're hopeful they'll reach an agreement on a new stimulus bill very soon. A series of stimulus programs keeping millions of Americans and small businesses afloat are set to expire in the coming weeks if lawmakers fail to pass new legislation. Globally, coronavirus cases have now topped 67 million and 1.5 million known deaths. In Iran, authorities have extended measures, including curfews and travel restrictions, as the death toll went past 50,000 over the weekend. South Korea is tightening its restrictions as cases spike, limiting gatherings and ordering gyms and karaoke bars to close. Argentina's Senate has approved what's being called a millionaire's tax, a one-off levy on around 12,000 of the richest citizens that will raise $3.7 billion to help the government respond to the coronavirus crisis and buoy Argentina's economy. Bahrain has become the second country to approve the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine after the UK, where the first doses of the vaccine are set to be administered starting Tuesday. Meanwhile, Moscow began distributing its Sputnik shot to clinics this weekend and said it's rolling out its nationwide voluntary vaccination program this week. And Indonesia has received its first shipment of a Chinese-manufactured coronavirus vaccine from Sinovac Biotech. In India, AstraZeneca Oxford University vaccine could be available for purchase by March, according to a major manufacturer, in the first indication that COVID-19 vaccines will become available in the private market in some places. The World Health Organization's Director General, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, said coronavirus vaccines must be treated as public goods.
We simply cannot accept a world in which the poor and marginalized are trampled by the rich and powerful in the stampede for vaccines. This is a global crisis, and the solutions must be shared equitably as global public goods, not as private commodities that widen inequalities.
The World Health Organization is also warning against complacency and other public health measures as vaccines start to roll out, emphasizing, quote, vaccines do not equal zero COVID. In Georgia, 2 Senate debates were held Sunday night ahead of Georgia's January 5th runoff election, which will decide who controls the U.S. Senate. In the first debate, Senator David Perdue refused to take part, so Democratic challenger Jon Ossoff stood on stage alongside an empty podium. In the second debate, Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler sparred with Democratic challenger Reverend Raphael Warnock. Loeffler refused to admit Trump lost the November election. On Saturday, Trump held a campaign rally in Georgia with Perdue and Loeffler. Trump spent most of the rally falsely claiming he had won in November. He also attacked Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp, who he had earlier endorsed. Earlier on Saturday, Trump called Kemp to urge him to call the Republican-led state legislature back into session so it could appoint Trump-supporting electors, essentially to overturn the election in the Electoral College. Kemp refused to do so. We'll have more on Georgia after headlines for the rest of the broadcast. Joe Biden's team will start receiving intelligence briefings from the Pentagon starting today as the presidential transition gets further underway. Biden is also set to meet for the first time with the White House chief vaccine advisor, Moncef Slaoui, this week. Meanwhile, Biden has tapped California Attorney General Javier Becerra to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. Becerra has filed at least 100 lawsuits against Trump, including against his immigration and environmental policies. He led the fight alongside 20 other states and Washington, D.C., to defend the Affordable Care Act as it was being attacked by Trump and the Republican Party. He's also voiced support for Medicare for all in the past. Becerra previously served as a Los Angeles Congress member and was the first Latinx to serve on the Ways and Means Committee. And in Congress, Democrats voted for New York Congressmember Gregory Meeks to become the new chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He'll be the first African-American in the role. Meeks beat out Texas Congressmember Joaquin Castro, who many progressives were backing. Environmental and labor advocates have called out Meeks' staunch support of free trade deals, including the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Activists say Meeks worked with Colombian politicians tied to right-wing paramilitaries to push a pro-corporate agenda. In a major victory for immigrant rights, a federal judge Friday ordered the Trump administration to fully and immediately restore DACA. That's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals in its original form. This means some 300,000 young people will be able to apply to DACA for the first time. It also restores work authorizations to 2 years and will make it easier for applicants to travel abroad before their application is approved. Friday's order comes over 3 years after Trump moved to end the landmark program in 2017, throwing the lives of hundreds of thousands of young people and their families into uncertainty. Since it was passed in 2012, DACA has granted protection from deportation and a work permit to at least 700,000 undocumented people who were brought to the United States as children. The House of Representatives voted Friday to decriminalize marijuana at the federal level and to expunge nonviolent convictions for marijuana-related offenses. The MORE Act also authorizes a 5% sales tax on marijuana products to be reinvested in community grants and programs, including job training, legal aid, and substance abuse treatment for communities who were disproportionately targeted by the war on drugs. This is California Congressmember Barbara Lee, who co-sponsored the bill, speaking on the House floor ahead of Friday's historic vote.
Black and brown people are targeted more frequently than white Americans despite equal rates of use. Additionally, prison sentences for black and brown people are more likely to be lengthier than white people. Black men receive sentences over 13% longer than white men, and nearly 80% of people in federal prisons for drug offenses are black or Latino.
The Trump administration announced it's pulling the majority of its 700 soldiers from Somalia, though many will remain stationed in the region, where the Pentagon says they'll continue to fight the presence of al-Shabaab. Some local leaders have condemned the timing of the move, which comes not just in the last weeks of Trump's presidency, but ahead of parliamentary elections in Somalia this month and presidential elections in February. Drone strikes in Somalia have increased significantly under Trump. Critics have argued counterterrorism operations in the region are conducted without proper accountability. Amnesty International has accused the U.S. of concealing civilian killings as part of al-Shabaab raids. In Peru, lawmakers have repealed a highly contested agricultural law following 5 days of demonstrations and roadblocks led by farm workers across Peru, and after at least one person was killed Thursday when police opened fire on protesters. On Friday, Peru's newly appointed interim president, Alejandro Sagasti, sent a bill to Congress revoking the law, which sought to increase agricultural exports and give exporters tax breaks. Farm workers said it benefited corporations while slashing their wages and worsening working conditions. Mourners gathered Saturday for the funeral of Ali Abu Alia, a Palestinian teenager who was killed by Israeli forces Friday. Israeli soldiers shot the teen in the stomach during a protest in the occupied West Bank. Palestinian officials called the act a war crime. The European Union delegation to the Palestinians called for a full investigation, tweeting, quote, "Children enjoy special protection under international law. How many more Palestinian children will be subject to the excessive use of lethal force by the Israeli security forces?" they asked. In Yemen, at least 8 civilians were killed and 13 others injured Thursday in an artillery attack on an industrial compound in the port city of Hodeidah. Yemen's Saudi-backed government blamed Houthi rebels for the deaths. The latest fighting in Yemen has exacerbated the world's worst humanitarian crisis, where the United Nations warns about 80% of Yemen's 30 million residents are in need of assistance. World Food Program Director David Beasley said Friday Yemen tops the list of nations at risk of famine due to war, disease, and the climate crisis.
We're now looking literally at 2021 being the worst humanitarian crisis year since the beginning of the United Nations. We have to prioritize, as I say, the icebergs in front of the Titanic. We've really got to give priority to famine, destabilization, and migration.
Beasley predicts a record 235 million people around the world will need humanitarian aid next year, a 40% increase from 2020. The World Food Program will receive the Nobel Peace Prize on Thursday, International Human Rights Day. In Venezuela, President Nicolás Maduro has claimed victory in parliamentary elections. Turnout was unusually low at just over 30% after the opposition leader, Juan Guaidó, called for a boycott of the election. Maduro is calling on incoming President Joe Biden to abandon the U.S. interventionist agenda in Venezuela and drop all sanctions. Back in the United States, in Ohio, activists are demanding justice for Casey Christopher Goodson, Jr., a 23-year-old black man who was fatally shot Friday by a Franklin County sheriff's deputy outside Goodson's home in Columbus. Family members say Goodson was carrying a Subway sandwich and was returning from a dentist's office when he was shot in the back 3 times by the sheriff's deputy. Authorities had been searching for a suspect in the area Friday afternoon when they say a man allegedly drove by waving a gun, prompting deputies to confront him. Authorities later said they recovered a handgun, but did not say where it was found. Family members say Goodson had a concealed carry permit for a handgun. They're demanding the release of body cam footage, police reports, and for an independent autopsy and investigation. And in Minnesota, Indigenous-led water protectors have launched a series of direct actions against the construction of Enbridge Line 3 pipeline, which would carry more than 750,000 barrels of tar sands oil a day through fragile ecosystems, endangering lakes, rivers, and wild rice beds. Activists say the pipeline violates treaties signed by the U.S. in 1854, 55, and 1867. Anishinaabe water protector Don Goodwin of the White Earth Reservation held a sit-in protest in the path of a pipeline construction crew Friday.
Treaties are the supreme law of the land.
Water protectors are also sounding the alarm over thousands of out-of-state workers brought in to work on construction of the Line 3 pipeline, warning they may add to a massive COVID-19 outbreak that's already overwhelming hospitals in rural Minnesota. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, we go to Georgia, where, well, there were 1.5 debates that took place Sunday ahead of the runoff election, which will decide who controls the U.S. Senate. Stay with us.
Año de 1900. Año de 1998 corría. En los Estados Unidos el grupo Arca nacía. En Houston, para ser exactos, peleando por la injusticia. De tan crueles congresistas, sus derechos les quitó.
Corrido de Arca, a ballad performed by Trio Imperial in Houston years ago, dedicated to the longtime activist Maria Jimenez. She died last week at the age of 70 after a struggle with cancer. Jimenez came to Houston from Mexico with her parents when she was a girl and became an influential immigrant and women's rights activist as a proud Chicana. She was also known for starting ARCA, the Association for Residency and Citizenship of America, of the American Friends Service Committee, after part of the Immigration Control and Reform Act of 1986 was revoked and nearly 400,000 immigrants faced deportation. Through her organizing, many of them instead became politically engaged citizens. One of the people she mentored was Harris County Judge Lina Hidalgo, who won an upset victory in 2018 to become the first woman and Latina elected to the powerful position. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Georgia, where, well, 1.5 debates were held Sunday night, ahead of Georgia's January 5th runoff election, which will decide who controls the U.S. Senate. Today is the last day for new voters to register in Georgia. In the most closely watched debate of the night, Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler sparred with Democratic challenger Reverend Raphael Warnock. Loeffler is the richest senator in the country and was appointed to her seat in January by Governor Kemp. She refused to say that President Trump lost the election.
You know, it's unfortunate that the focus is on a debate about who won the election when this process is still playing out. And President Trump has every right to every legal recourse. But we also have to make sure that Georgians know that we have a process that works, that their vote is counted, and that no illegal votes are counted.
Senator Loeffler repeatedly attacked her challenger, Reverend Raphael Warnock. In fact, she almost never said his name without prefacing it by saying radical liberal Raphael Warnock. But Warnock, who's the pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, pastored by the Kings, pushed back.
Look, it's clear to me that my opponent is going to work really hard, spending millions of dollars of her own money trying to push a narrative about me, because she's clearly decided that she does not have a case to be made for why she should stay in that seat. I do not want to defund the police, and Kelly Loeffler knows it. But she keeps saying this because she wants to distract from her own record. The truth of the matter is, were it left up to her, Georgians would not have received the $600 of expanded unemployment insurance. And they haven't seen any relief in months. And she hasn't done anything. She's done nothing to provide relief for ordinary people, the folks I'm seeing all across this state who are in pain in the middle of this pandemic.
Reverend Warnock contrasted how he grew up in the projects of Savannah, Georgia, with his opponent, Senator Loeffler, the richest member of the U.S. Senate, and accused her of using her position for personal gain, saying she publicly played down the pandemic but sold stocks earlier this year after receiving a coronavirus briefing.
When you receive the private briefing regarding the coronavirus pandemic, you dumped millions of dollars of stock in order to protect your own investments. And then weeks later, when there came an opportunity to give ordinary Georgians an extra $600 of relief, you said you saw no need and called it counterproductive. Why do you think it's counterproductive to help ordinary Georgians in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, thank you for that question, because I've been completely exonerated. Those are lies perpetrated by the left-wing media.
At the other Georgia Senate debate that took place last night, well, only one candidate showed up. This is how the debate began.
The candidates are in alphabetical order. Democrat Jon Ossoff. He is CEO of Insight TWI, a media production company that investigates corruption, organized crime, and war crimes for international news organizations. Republican David Perdue has served in the U.S. Senate since 2015. Before his election, he sat on the board of 5 major corporations and co-founded Perdue Partners, a global trading company. Senator Perdue declined to participate in this debate and is represented by an empty podium.
This marks the second time the Republican Senator David Perdue has refused to debate Jon Ossoff. He also pulled out of the final debate prior to the November election after Ossoff described him as a crook. Perdue is facing increasing scrutiny over trading stocks of companies overseen by committees he sits on in the U.S. Senate. The New York Times revealed last week Perdue has traded stocks, bonds, and mutual funds nearly 2,600 times over the past 6 years, by far the most of any U.S. senator. He sometimes reported 20 or more transactions in a single day. The Sunday night debates came one day after President Trump traveled to Valdosta, Georgia, for a campaign rally with Perdue and Loeffler. It was Trump's first public rally since losing the election, but Trump spent most of the rally falsely claiming he won. He also attacked Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp, who he'd earlier supported. Earlier on Saturday, Trump called Kemp to urge him to call the Republican-led state legislature back into session so it could appoint Trump-supporting electors to the Electoral College, essentially to overturn the election. Kemp refused to do so. To talk more about Georgia, we're joined by three guests. Carol Anderson is with us. She is professor at Emory University, the author of White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. Her most recent book is One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. She's joining us from Atlanta. We're also joined by Democratic State Representative Bee Nguyen of Georgia. Her district includes Atlanta. And Cliff Albright is with us. He is co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter and a 2020 Soros Equality Fellow. Cliff Albright had a watch party last night for the debate. There is much to talk about. Professor Carol Anderson, let's begin with you. Quite an active weekend for the whole country to watch in Georgia, since Georgia will determine the balance of the U.S. Senate. If both Democrats were to win these races in the runoffs on January 5th, the U.S. Senate would be 50-50 Republican-Democrat, with the vice president, that would be Kamala Harris, being the tiebreaker. But what happens still remains to be seen. So there were 1.5 debates last night. David Perdue did not attend his, so it was Jon Ossoff's alone, and then the highly contentious debate between Warnock and Loeffler. Talk about what you watched this weekend.
I watched a series of lies. I watched Loeffler mastering sound bites without any kind of depth, but a way to try to define Reverend Warnock in ways that would resonate with a base that is bereft of evidence. I saw an attempt to a coup, an attempt to overthrow an election, and I saw the weakness of both Perdue and Loeffler in challenging that. So even when Loeffler is asked point blank about the election, she says, well, it doesn't matter. It's not about who won. Yes, it is. But what we're seeing is that as she was casting aspersions out there, that this is the lie of voter fraud that the Republicans have sown for decades. And it is now really taking root in a most horrific way. And it is a lie. It is designed to cast aspersions on the American citizenship, the right to vote for African Americans, for Asian Americans, for Hispanics. That's what I saw this weekend.
State Representative Bee Nguyen, if you can talk about the significance of what's taking place in your state and what is at stake, both statewide and also nationally.
Yes, as all eyes are on Georgia, we know that the country is watching us and watching the response to our election. As Dr. Carol Anderson said, the Trump administration, backed by other Republicans across the state of Georgia, with the exception of our governor, the lieutenant governor, and the secretary of state, are pushing forward conspiracy theories. They are pushing forward lies about the election with no substantiated evidence. We just had Rudy Giuliani here in the state of Georgia last week, in which he brought forward witnesses who did not understand the complexity of Georgia election laws, who did not have any evidence to back up their claims, and they separated the secretary of state from that hearing, so there was no opportunity to respond and to refute these arguments that have already been refuted nationally, have already been refuted in our state. And that resulted in increased death threats for election workers. It resulted in death threats to two of our sitting senators who pushed forward the truth, who pushed back on Giuliani's team. And what we're seeing is a referendum on the Trump administration. The last 4 years, they have wreaked havoc, and Georgia voters are tired of that. The country is tired of that. What we're also seeing is the last 4 years, the Trump administration has sanctioned violence and encouraged violence, and we're seeing those threats play out in real time. We're also seeing the combination of the pandemic play out in these election hearings and these rallies. Giuliani was just diagnosed with COVID yesterday, and he's put every single one of those senators in that room at risk. He was there without a mask. There were many other people there without a mask. We have 2 sitting senators who deny that there is a pandemic and who continue to allow the president to push these lies that undermine our democracy.
If you could go more into what do you mean, the 2 senators, Perdue and Loeffler. Again, Loeffler was not ever elected. She was appointed by Kemp, who she refused to fully back up versus Trump in the debate. But what do you mean? What are they saying about a coronavirus where there is, like in all over the country, a major surge in Georgia?
Well, they're not really saying anything. And the fact that Perdue didn't show up at the debate yesterday is indicative of his leadership in Georgia. He just not has shown up for the state of Georgia and working families in Georgia. They have not followed science on the virus. They continue to hold rallies without encouraging social distancing, without telling their supporters to wear masks. And we are seeing the results of what happens when people come in close proximity with each other, when large gatherings are happening. They have not pushed forward a stimulus package. You mentioned earlier that Americans are waiting for another round of stimulus. I have constituents who reach out to me every single week telling me they have not even seen unemployment that they've filed for many, many months ago. People are losing their homes. They're getting sick. They are unemployed, losing their cars. Working families need our senators to respond to the pandemic, to follow science, to show them that they understand what it means when we have a public pandemic that is just ravaging us economically. These 2 senators understood that this was going to be an issue, and instead of informing the public, they took advantage of that information and used it to trade their stocks. And that is not the type of representation that we need here in Georgia or in our Senate.
I want to go back in history to the last time Senator David Perdue debated Jon Ossoff. After this, he refused to debate him again. This is Jon Ossoff speaking to Perdue in the debate in late October.
You've continued to demean yourself throughout this campaign with your conduct. First, you were lengthening my nose in attack ads to remind everybody that I'm Jewish. And then when that didn't work, you started calling me some kind of Islamic terrorist. And then when that didn't work, you started calling me a Chinese communist. It's ridiculous.
So, State Representative B. Wen, this pretty much blew him off the stage for the rest of debates. He also called him a criminal and said whether it's him or his handlers in Washington, is it really worth selling your soul, he said, for doing what was happening. Carol Anderson, State Representative Nguyen, if you can talk about the significance of what he was saying.
Yeah, Jon Ossoff has called Perdue out. He is not being shy about calling him out for who he is. He is speaking the truth about this sitting senator who is xenophobic, who is racist, who does have a history of standing by Trump side by side, who is not pushing forward any policy solutions. He is ready to take healthcare away from Americans during a pandemic. He has no policy issues to stand behind. In fact, when Jon Ossoff was visiting a small business, Slutty Vegan, one that is Black-owned, who has done just a tremendous job of expanding their entrepreneurship throughout the city of Atlanta, Perdue's response was to make fun of Jon Ossoff for visiting this business. These are small businesses in the state of Georgia who need support economically, who need us to uplift the small businesses. And quite frankly, I don't know of any American on either side of the aisle who support demeaning and belittling a small business. And it just shows how out of touch Senator Perdue is with working Georgians.
You mentioned death threats against state legislators. You yourself, State Representative Binh Nguyen, have a fascinating background. You're the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants. You're the first Vietnamese American state representative. Your family then went on to help settle a Syrian refugee family in 2015. Can you talk about how your own life story informs what you do today and your response to the politics of Georgia and the divisions right now?
Absolutely. I mean, my life story and my lived experience informs me on policies and informs me on humanity, quite frankly. When my parents left Vietnam, they fled in the middle of the night on a boat. And at the time, it was President Jimmy Carter who expanded the number of Vietnamese refugees being accepted into America. And it was a Republican governor, Governor Robert Ray from Iowa, who opened his state and said, we will accept as many refugees as we can into the state of Iowa. That bipartisan spirit is completely absent in today's politics. And growing up in a state like Georgia, I'm part of what we call the New South, a coalition of Black, Brown, Asian, young folks, progressive folks who want to see a state and a country that embraces diversity and that understands that cultural differences and what we contribute makes our country unique and special. And that's what makes America great, quite frankly. We've been battling the last 4 years the rise of white supremacy and nationalism, which we know has always existed in this country. But when it's endorsed by somebody who is at the highest sitting office, who has pushed forward this idea of violence against people, threatening people, where this has become a norm, it's a time and a place where being in Georgia is critically important as the world is watching us and how we respond. And I'm very disappointed in my colleagues who have not spoken up against the violence being directed to our two sitting senators, to the Secretary of State and his wife, to Gabe Sterling, to the governor. It's unacceptable. It is not how we want to live in this country. And it is being pushed by Trump, and he has enabled this, to rise to the surface. And we really need to grapple with what that means for our country and for our state and how we can move forward, because we can't take this anymore. It is literally endangering the lives of people who are just doing their jobs, who are just trying to make this country a better place for everybody.
I wanted to go to Gabe Sterling, the election manager you talked about. Again, the state leadership of Georgia is Republican. The state election manager, Gabe Sterling, the Secretary of State, and, of course, Brian Kemp, the governor. I want to go to Gabe Sterling, who made this emotional plea last week around the Republican leadership of our country, around President Trump and Giuliani, who was just there, now tested positive for COVID-19 after not clear how many people he posed with. None of them was he wearing a mask. This is Gabe Sterling.
Mr. President, it looks like you likely lost the state of Georgia. We're investigating. There's always a possibility. I get it. And you have the rights to go through the courts. What you don't have the ability to do, and you need to step up and say this, is stop inspiring people to commit potential acts of violence. Someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get shot. Someone's going to get killed. That was Gabe Sterling.
I want to go back to the debate that took place last night. In August, players with the WNBA's, the Women's Basketball League, Atlanta Dream, urged fans to elect Senate Democratic candidate Raphael Warnock. Senator Kelly Loeffler is the co-owner of the franchise. Several players arrived at the league's coronavirus bubble in Florida wearing black T-shirts that read, "Vote Warnock," in white letters. The action came after Loeffler slammed the WNBA's Racial Justice Initiative for the 2020 season, saying any alignment with the Black Lives Matter movement sends a message of exclusion as they seek to defund the police. This is debate panelist Lisa Graham questioning Loeffler.
You've called the Black Lives Matter movement fascist. You've alienated members of your own basketball team by talking about that stance, or taking that stance, rather. Is that still your view tonight after seeing and hearing how it hits home with so many people personally?
The life of every African American is important, and there is no place for racism in this country. But there are organizations whose number one goal is to defund the police. And we know that that hurts minority communities more than anyone. And we have to stand with our men and women of law enforcement.
Carol Anderson, can you talk about this constant refrain of Senator Loeffler as she would continually attack Reverend Warnock?
Yes, I mean, this defund the police, radical leftist, radical defund. Those are like it's putting like chum in the water for a base that is feeling, as Trump said, victimized. They're victims. But the real problem here is that it is a racist dog whistle. And that's what we have to understand. It is deliberately misunderstanding what Black Lives Matter is really all about. It is designed to wipe that away, the same way they called Martin Luther King a communist, is what she was doing to Reverend Warnock yesterday. And what this is about is what she didn't deal with was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George Floyd had a knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Loeffler will not deal with that. She will not deal with 7 bullets in the back of Jacob Blake. She will not deal with a basic no-knock warrant that ended up killing Breonna Taylor. So this is what Black Lives Matter is talking about, is the use of state violence against Black people. Instead, she engages in these dog whistles that are designed to create this fervor for holding back this supposedly Black mass that will overturn everything, overturn the American dream. It is racist marketing 101.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion, and we'll be joined by Cliff Albright, who is suing the Georgia Secretary of State, his organization, for pulling something like 200,000 voters off the voter rolls. Carol Anderson is a professor at Emory University. Georgia Representative Bee Wynn is in the Georgia legislature, and will be joined by Cliff Albright, who is one of the co-founders of Black Voters Matter. Stay with us.
Every record needs a thesis, needs a crisis or campaign. All my feelings need a reason, need a righteousness or blame. What if leaving wasn't of the mind? The root and crown don't doubt the winter time. Underground, the dark and cooling earth embraces what can sink to itself and fall for miles into a timeless darkening. And from the depths will come the brightest fire.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report, That Root and Crown by Young Jesus. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue to discuss what took place in Georgia this weekend ahead of the January 5th runoff senatorial elections. Sunday's debates for Georgia's Senate candidates fell on the eve of the registration deadline today for Georgians who want to vote in the special runoff election on January 5th. Yes, that deadline's today, Monday, December 7th. This comes after Georgia Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger repeated his demand that President Trump stop promoting conspiracy theories about a stolen election, saying Trump's rhetoric is fueling violent threats against election officials.
This is exactly the kind of language that is at the base of growing threat environment for election workers who are simply doing their jobs.
But that's exactly what President Trump did this weekend in Georgia, continued to deny that Biden had won the elections, continued to attack the Republican leadership of Georgia, which in the past he had always supported. He even made a call to the Republican governor, Brian Kemp, before he came to the rally, demanding that he have the legislature choose Trump-allied electors for the Electoral College to overturn the will of the people. Georgia voted for the first time in years narrowly for the Democrat, for Joe Biden. For more, we are joined by three guests, and we're going to begin with Atlanta organizer Cliff Albright, co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter. We thank you so much for being with us, Cliff. Interestingly, you are suing your organization, along with a number of organizations, are suing the Secretary of State of Georgia. Explain why.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Amy. Back in 2019, and really in each year, Georgia has done a series of voter purges. And in 2019, what we discovered is that there were 200,000 who were purged allegedly because they had moved, who had, in fact, not moved. Their addresses had not changed. The problem is that the Secretary of State used an illegal vendor. They used a non-official source for the addresses to send out the notifications that they used to verify whether or not folks had moved. Then when they didn't get a response, they used that as a rationale to purge people. What we argued is that there was really only one vendor. There was only one official way to check those addresses. And if they had done so, then they would have seen that those folks had not moved, that 200,000 had not moved. And so they were purged illegally. In fact, when we sent out postcards to notify these voters that they had been purged and that they need to check their registration status, out of 100,000 that we sent out, we only got back a couple of hundred, which means that the vast majority of those addresses that we sent them to using the official vendor actually made it to the people that it was supposed to make it to. So that's the basis of our lawsuit. At the end of the day, this election that, has gone into a recount, 2-3 different recounts, it should not have even been close. And that's one of the main things that we want folks to recognize about Georgia elections is that without the suppression that's been taking place under previous Secretary of State Kemp, as well as the current Secretary of State, we don't want him to be viewed as a profile in courage. He's still been a large-scale voter suppression advocate. He's still intimidating voting rights organizations. And so without that form of intimidation, this would not have even been a close election.
Explain that further. How is he intimidating voting rights organizations?
Yeah, just as an example, just in this past week, even as he and his staff have been saying things like, somebody's going to get hurt, they've also announced that they're investigating 4 organizations that do voter registration, including our dear friends at the New Georgia Project, which has been a constant target of the Secretary of State's office. So, what we have to recognize is it's nice for you to say, hey, Mr. President, somebody's going to get hurt. There's going to be violence. But the fact of the matter is when you lead this kind of propaganda that there's voter fraud taking place, right? Whether it's coming out of Raffensperger's mouth or whether it's coming out of Loeffler's mouth on the debate stage, when you push that narrative that you've got these organizations out there that are doing these nefarious activities, that are bringing people into the state and having people vote illegally, when you do that kind of soft narrative or soft incites of violence, it has the same impact of what Trump is saying. And that's been going on in this state for far too long. And Secretary Raffensperger has his hands dirty with it.
I wanted to go to Saturday's rally that Trump held in Georgia. Much of his speech focusing on the November presidential election results. He repeated his baseless claims of widespread voter fraud in the election and called for sweeping barriers to voting access in the future.
We need to pass landmark election reform, including voter ID. Is that so bad? Residency verification, like we live in the country, we live in the state. Citizenship confirmation. They want to say, oh, he doesn't have to be a citizen. You got to see what's voting. They're not citizens. You're a citizen? No, I'm not a citizen. You speak English? No no English. Speak no English.
Can you respond to this, Cliff Albright, and talk about the effect this is having in Georgia and who has to register by today? Of course, regular voters, for example, who voted in November, they are registered, so they don't have to register. But what do people have to do, and when can they start voting for the January 5th senatorial runoffs?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways for me to respond to Trump's comments. I mean, on the one hand, the simplest answer is obviously he's making things up. These are all untrue. This is disinformation. This is, hate mongering. This is all the things that we know it is, right? The other way that I answer that question, though, honestly, Amy, is that I say, you know what? If he wants to come to Georgia, come on. If he wants to do his little hate rallies, go on and do them. Because what he's doing, in part, is for all those voters who are celebrating the fact that we beat him, right? And we turned and we flipped Georgia, but that may have been thinking, okay, I did my job in November. I don't really have to get as involved in this runoff election. If there are folks that were out there thinking about that, black voters in particular, guess what? He is reminding us of just how important this runoff election is. Keep in mind that between he and Pence, I think they came to Georgia at least 3 or 4 times leading up to the general election, and that didn't work out too well for them. So if he wants to come and do his little KKK rallies, that's fine with me. The other answer, though, to that is in terms of the voter registration deadline, is that, yes, today's the deadline. We're encouraging everybody to register. We're encouraging folks who are already registered to get 10 other people to register, because everybody's got a role to play in being an organizer and reaching out to folks to get them registered. There's 23,000, I think it is, 18-year-olds. People turning 18 between November 3rd and January 5th. We've been doing outreach targeted to them, formerly incarcerated folks that have their rights to vote. Anybody who's not yet registered, today's the deadline. We're encouraging everybody to go. And we're encouraging everybody to check their registration status. That's the other piece of this. We want people to be newly registered, but even if you're already registered, check your registration status so that we can make sure that there's no funny business going on and that you're registered, that you know what your accurate and correct polling place is. And we're doing all these things across the state. We've got partners, community-based partners in 50 counties throughout the state of Georgia, Middle Georgia, Metro Atlanta, the mid-sized cities, Southwest Georgia, all across the state, where on a daily basis we've got partners going out reminding people about the voter registration deadlines, and that not only can they be voting by mail right now, but that starting next Monday, December 14th, early vote starts in Georgia.
Professor Carol Anderson, your most recent book, One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Can you talk about what's happened since you've written that book? Do you hold out more hope? And can you talk about the effect of the President of the United States continually alleging voter fraud, continually saying, as he did in Valdosta on Saturday night, again saying that he actually won the election?
Yes, this is, I think of Trump as he's not an aberration, he's the culmination. He is the culmination of decades of the Republicans hollering voting fraud, of creating the theater of voter fraud as a means to justify massive voter suppression, as a means to justify voter ID, where the state's legislatures are identifying IDs that African Americans don't have, and making those the access point to the ballot box, in terms of shutting down polling stations, in terms of creating the imagery again. You heard him talking about all of these non-citizens voting. Do you speak English? Well, the Voting Rights Act has language in there that deals with communities that have sizable non-English speaking American citizens, and that states are to be responsive to that population by printing the ballots in that language, as well as having poll workers and election folks there who can help in that language. And so what you hear in this kind of xenophobic thing is to undermine American democracy.
Carol Anderson, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Professor at Emory University, author of One Person, No Vote. Cliff Albright, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. And I want to thank Democratic State Representative Bee Wynn of Georgia. We're going to end today's show in nearby Alabama with civil rights attorney Brian Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative. He was one of 4 human rights defenders who won this year's Right Livelihood Award last Thursday. This was his acceptance speech.
I work in a country that has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. I work against a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. We work to overturn this horrific era of mass incarceration in America that has been brought about by the politics of fear and anger, and in too many places across the world. We're being governed by people who preach fear and anger are the essential ingredients of oppression and abuse. And we need a community of people to stand up against it. That's what human rights work is about for me. It's about challenging these conditions that have been so brutal, so toxic, so critically unfair. There are thousands of innocent people in our jails and prisons, and we're going to continue fighting for them. I am the descendant of one of the 12 million Africans who were abducted, kidnapped, trafficked to this continent 400 years ago. My great-grandparents were enslaved. They had to deal with the bondage and horrors of slavery in this nation. And yet they persevered. They had a hope. They had a belief. They had a commitment to freedom and equality. I'm standing in front of jars. And behind me, these jars represent the thousands of Black people who were lynched in America. These were collected at sites across America for a century. African Americans were brutalized, pulled out of their homes, beaten, bloodied, drowned, torched, lynched in a nation where lawlessness reigned. I am the child of people born into Jim Crow. My parents were humiliated and denigrated by those signs that said white and colored. And they weren't directions, they were assaults. They created injuries. And our nation has not confronted those injuries. I began my education in a colored school. And I wouldn't be here today if lawyers hadn't come into our community and made it possible for me to go to high school and college and law school. And Mr. Hinton and I still live in a nation where there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that burdens Black and brown people. We've been in the streets this summer trying to confront this legacy of racial inequality that continues to contaminate our nation. We are not yet free. We have not dealt with this horrific narrative. My great-grandparents were enslaved. They had to deal with brutality and bondage, but the greatest victimization they suffered was this narrative that was created during slavery that Black people aren't as good as white people, that Black people are less human, Black people are less evolved, Black people are less deserving, Black people are less capable. That narrative is the narrative that we are fighting against. I'm in Montgomery, Alabama. It's a community where a generation ago, people put on their Sunday best to protest, to fight for equality and justice. They knew they would get bloodied and battered and beaten, but they went anyway. I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. And because of them, I am determined that we must keep fighting. Because of them, I believe that we must stand up even when people say sit down. We must speak even when people say be quiet. Wherever human rights are being violated, wherever injustice can be found, wherever inequality can be seen, there have to be a community of people who fight. And I am honored to be among that community and to receive this recognition today for that fight. Thank you so very much for doing what you've done for me, but more than that, for all of the people around the world suffering from inequality and injustice. Thank you for recognizing the importance of our struggle.
Brian Stevenson is winner of this year's Right Livelihood Award, awarded last Thursday. To see the full ceremony, you can go to democracynow.org, referred to often as the Alternative Nobel. This Thursday, on December 10th, International Human Rights Day, the Nobel Peace Prize will be given to the World Food Program, and of course, we'll be covering it. A very happy birthday to Igor Moreno. That does it for today's broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tay Maria Studio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, and Adriana Contreras. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman.